name is Megan Whitmore. I am 36 years old, a mother of one, and until recently, I was what most people would describe as the steady one in a loud, ambitious family. If you met me at a holiday dinner, you probably wouldn't notice me first. I'm not the one telling the biggest stories or dominating the conversation. I'm usually refilling glasses, clearing plates, and listening more than I speak. In my husband's family business, a mid-sized logistics company that's been passed down for 2 generations, I was seen the same way. Supportive, helpful, dependable, harmless. For years, that perception worked in everyone's favor. I handled operations quietly. I streamlined vendor contracts. I reorganized internal systems that no one else wanted to touch. When things ran smoothly, it was because they were supposed to. When something broke, I was the one who fixed it. But I was never official. The turning point of this story has a simple sentence attached to it. They laughed when I asked to be on the family business papers. It wasn't a cruel laugh. That's almost what made it worse. It was casual, dismissive, as if I had suggested something mildly absurd, like renaming the company after myself. The kind of laugh people give when they don't even realize they're minimizing you. What followed wasn't dramatic. There were no screaming matches, no slammed doors, no revenge plots. There was just a shift, because in that moment, something inside me went quiet in a way it never had before. I stopped trying to explain my value. I stopped asking for acknowledgement. I stopped correcting assumptions. And without announcing it to anyone, I made a decision. I stopped asking. I started preparing. This story isn't about destroying a family or exposing secrets. It's about what happens when someone underestimated decides to understand the system better than anyone else in the room. It's about power that doesn't raise its voice. It's about the difference between being included and being entitled. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you how I went from an invisible support role to someone they could no longer afford to overlook. Not through luck, not through manipulation, but through patience, documentation, discipline, and silence. I won't paint myself as a victim. I stayed longer than I should have. I accepted less than I deserved. And I played the role they handed me until I realized I didn't have to. If you've ever felt quietly essential but publicly dismissed, you might recognize parts of yourself in this. Have you ever smiled in a room where you were already planning your exit? In my husband Daniel's family, roles were assigned early and rarely questioned. His father, Richard, was the founder, decisive, commanding, a man who believed that hesitation was weakness. His older brother, Mark, was the numbers guy, though in truth, he preferred appearances over spreadsheets. Daniel was the negotiator, the one with charm and instinct. And me? I was the helper. Not officially, of course. On paper, I was operations coordinator, a practical title, respectable enough to mention at networking events. But inside the company walls, my role was simpler. Fix what no one else wanted to deal with. When a shipment was delayed because of an overlooked customs detail, I called the port authority and untangled it. When a vendor quietly increased rates over 6 months, I noticed and renegotiated the contract. When internal reporting systems were outdated and costing us efficiency, I rebuilt them on my own time. No one resisted my help. They relied on it. But reliance and recognition are not the same thing. At meetings, I sat slightly back from the table. Not physically exiled, just subtly peripheral. The big conversations flowed around strategy, expansion, and acquisitions. I handled implementation, logistics, details. Richard used to say, Megan keeps the engine running. He meant it as praise. But engines aren't invited to the boardroom. When clients visited, I was introduced warmly. This is Megan. She handles operations. There was always a tone shift after that, as if I were the responsible adult in a room of visionaries. Necessary, but not visionary. I learned to make myself small in comfortable ways. I spoke when I had something airtight to contribute. I prepared memos instead of interrupting. I emailed suggestions rather than challenging someone mid meeting. It wasn't fear, it was a strategy. Or at least that's what I told myself. In truth, I had internalized something much older. Growing up, I was the eldest daughter in a family where harmony mattered more than individual credit. My mother used to say, if you know your value, you don't need to shout it. I believe that deeply. I still do in many ways. But there's a difference between not shouting and not being seen. In Daniel's family, I was appreciated like infrastructure. When everything worked, no one thought about it. When something cracked, they looked to me quietly and expected it to be repaired. And I delivered. Every time. There were subtle tells in the way they positioned me socially, too. At extended family gatherings, when conversations drifted toward the company's future, Richard would say things like, the boys are thinking about expanding into Nevada next year. The boys. I had built the operational model that would make that expansion possible. I had already drafted contingency plans. But in that narrative, I wasn't part of the future. I was part of the support. Daniel never intended harm. That's important to say. He respected me at home. He trusted my judgment privately. He often asked for my opinion before big decisions. But in public, he let the structure stand. And I let him, because invisibility can feel safe. When you're not officially responsible, you can't officially fail. When your name isn't on the documents, you can't be blamed if something collapses. At least, that's the illusion. Over time, I noticed something else. When I offered ideas, they were considered carefully, but often reintroduced later by someone else with more authority attached to the same sentence. The room would nod differently, more firmly. I began recognizing the pattern, not malicious, not even deliberate, just habitual. Megan handles details. The men handle decisions. And I fit the picture so seamlessly that no one questioned it, including me. Looking back, I realized I wasn't just unseen. I was convenient, reliable enough to depend on, quiet enough not to threaten, capable enough to carry weight, official enough to work hard, unofficial enough to exclude from ownership. If someone had asked me then whether I felt disrespected, I would have said no. I would have defended them. I would have explained that family businesses are complex, that transitions take time, and that tradition matters. I truly believed patience would eventually translate into acknowledgement. What I didn't yet understand was this. Patience without positioning is just waiting, and waiting in the wrong room can become your identity. The first time it happened, it was almost forgettable. That's the thing about pivotal moments. They rarely arrive with music playing in the background. They slip in quietly, disguised as something ordinary. We were in the conference room on a Tuesday afternoon. Nothing dramatic. Quarterly review. The kind of meeting where everyone pretends to enjoy pie charts. I had spent 2 weeks preparing a restructuring proposal. Our freight margins were thinning because of inefficiencies in route assignments, small misalignments that compounded over time. I'd analyzed 3 years of data, identified patterns, and built a model that would cut unnecessary transfers by 18%. It wasn't glamorous work, but it mattered. When my turn came, I walked them through it calmly. No theatrics, just numbers, projections, and implementation steps. I remember Mark leaning back in his chair, half listening, tapping a pen against his notepad. When I finished, there was a pause. Richard nodded slowly. Interesting, he said. That's a lot of operational detail. Operational detail. Not a strategic shift, not a cost saving breakthrough. Detail, Daniel added. It's solid, Meg. We'll think about how it fits into the bigger picture. The bigger picture, I smiled. I always smiled. 2 weeks later, we had another meeting. This time, Mark presented an idea about optimizing route clusters to improve margin performance. He described it broadly, without the data depth I had provided. The room lit up. Richard leaned forward. Now that's strategic thinking. I felt the air shift. It was my model, my framework, even some of my phrasing, but simplified, abstracted, delivered with confidence and ownership. No one looked at me, and I didn't speak. It would have been easy to interrupt, to say gently, yes, that's what I outlined in the previous meeting. It would have been factually accurate, professional, even necessary. But in that moment, I calculated something instinctively. If I corrected him, it would create friction. If I let it pass, the idea would still be implemented. The company would benefit. And I wasn't someone who needed applause to function. So I chose harmony. After the meeting, Mark clapped me lightly on the shoulder. Good groundwork last week, he said. Helped me see the angle. Groundwork, I nodded. Glad it was useful. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. Not angry, not even hurt exactly, just unsettled. It wasn't the credit. It was the pattern forming in real time. The quiet reclassification of my contribution from authorship to assistance. And what bothered me most wasn't that they overlooked me. It was that they didn't even realize they had. Over the next few months, the route optimization plan rolled out. It performed exactly as projected. Margins improved. Richard praised Mark for thinking ahead. Daniel congratulated his brother on stepping up strategically. No one meant to erase me. That's what I kept telling myself. Still, something inside me recorded the moment carefully. Not emotionally, just factually, like a timestamp, because it wasn't loud enough to protest, but it was sharp enough to remember. That was the first small cut, and small cuts, if repeated often enough, don't bleed dramatically. They numb you. After the first time, it became easier to miss. Not because it stopped happening, but because I started adjusting to it. The route optimization plan was just the beginning. Over the next year, my contributions followed a familiar rhythm. I would research, draft, structure, and refine. Then, in meetings, the ideas would be reshaped, often by someone with a louder voice or a last name that carried more weight. And each time, I told myself a reasonable story. It's a family business. Hierarchy takes time to evolve. They don't mean anything by it. You're building credibility quietly. That last one became my favorite. I convinced myself I was playing the long game. That visibility would come naturally once they couldn't deny the results anymore. That real power didn't need acknowledgement. But something subtle began happening inside me. I started rehearsing sentences in my head before meetings. carefully neutral ways to reinforce ownership without sounding defensive. I would prepare documentation trails, time-stamped drafts, and shared folders. Not because I expected confrontation, but because I felt the need to anchor myself somewhere concrete. At home, Daniel remained supportive in private. He would ask, "What do you think about the expansion?" And when I shared detailed concerns, he'd nod thoughtfully. "You always see angles we miss," he'd say. Always. Yet in the boardroom, those angles became collective discoveries. One afternoon, during a supplier renegotiation, I pointed out that a long standing contract included an auto renewal clause that heavily favored the vendor. We had been absorbing incremental price hikes without a formal review. Richard waved a hand dismissively. "We've worked with them for years. It's stable." I didn't push. 3 months later, when the cumulative cost increase finally triggered concern, Mark announced he'd dug into the fine print and found the issue. It was framed as proactive vigilance. Again, I said nothing. What surprised me most wasn't their behavior. It was mine. Each time it happened, I felt a flicker of something, an urge to step forward, to clarify, to stake a claim. But almost immediately, another voice would intervene. "Don't be petty. Don't create tension. This isn't about ego." And it wasn't. At least, that's what I believed. I told myself that mature professionals don't chase validation. Secure women don't compete for credit. Marriage and business require compromise. But there's a quiet difference between humility and erasure, and I was beginning to blur that line. Socially, it continued too. At industry events, introductions framed me as Daniel's wife who helps with operations. I would shake hands confidently, contribute thoughtfully when asked, and watch conversations drift back toward the Whitmore men. Sometimes, other executives would assume I handled HR or internal admin. I corrected them politely, always politely. No one ever openly disrespected me. That's what made it so difficult to confront. There were no insults, no overt exclusion, just a steady, almost gentle positioning that kept me adjacent to power rather than inside it. And over time, I internalized that adjacency. I began to anticipate being overlooked. In meetings, I spoke less, not because I had less to say, but because I subconsciously prepared for my ideas to travel further if delivered by someone else. I would feed suggestions to Daniel beforehand, knowing he could introduce them more effectively. I told myself it was teamwork. Maybe it was. But teamwork implies shared ownership. What we had was asymmetrical attribution. The most dangerous part of repeated dismissal isn't anger, it's an adaptation. You start adjusting your expectations downward. You redefine fairness to fit the environment. You measure success by stability instead of growth. And slowly, invisibility stops feeling like an accident. It feels like your role. By the end of that year, I had become exceptionally efficient at being indispensable and unofficial. I didn't protest. I didn't argue. I didn't demand acknowledgement. I normalized it, and normalization is powerful. Because once something feels normal, it stops feeling negotiable. There's a moment when you realize the role you're playing isn't accidental, it's structural. For me, that realization didn't come during a meeting or an argument. It came during something far more ordinary, a holiday dinner at Richard's house. The dining table was long, heavy oak, polished to a reflective shine. Conversations flowed easily. Expansion plans, market shifts, competitors. The men spoke in confident, declarative sentences. I refilled glasses. I passed dishes. I listened. At one point, Richard raised his glass slightly and said, "I'm proud of how the boys are steering this company. It's staying in the family." "The boys," Daniel smiled. Mark nodded modestly. The room hummed with approval. I felt something settle in my chest. Not sharp, not painful, just clear. Staying in the family, I was legally part of that family. I had poured years of labor into that company. I had designed systems that protected it from internal collapse more than once. But in that narrative, family meant lineage, not contribution. I wasn't excluded maliciously. I was simply categorized. The reliable one, the support system, the glue, useful, invisible. The next week at the office, I started paying attention differently. Not emotionally, analytically. I watched how decisions flowed. Ideas introduced by Richard or Mark were immediately treated as directional. Ideas introduced by me were treated as informative. Supporting data, operational input. Even when my recommendations shaped outcomes, the authority stamp landed elsewhere. And then I noticed something else. When problems escalated, real problems, I was the first call. If a, the- if a warehouse manager threatened to quit unexpectedly, Daniel called me. If compliance documentation was flagged during an audit, Richard asked me to handle it. If client retention dipped, Mark requested my analysis. I was trusted with risk, but not with ownership. There's a profound difference between being trusted to fix and being trusted to lead. And I had been assigned firmly to the first category. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation through the partially open conference room door. Richard was speaking with their attorney about long-term succession planning. "We'll make sure the boys are protected," he said. "Equity distribution needs to stay clean." The boys. I stood still in the hallway longer than I should have. Equity distribution. In that moment, the invisible boundary became visible. I wasn't just unofficial socially, I was unofficially legal. All the years of contribution, all the operational backbone I'd built, none of it translated into a formal stake. My income came as a salary, stable, comfortable, replaceable. That word echoed quietly. Replaceable. I went back to my office and opened the company's organizational documents. Not the ones I use daily, but the archived formation papers, shareholder agreements, and board structures. My name appeared nowhere beyond employment records. That wasn't an oversight. It was designed, and suddenly, past interactions rearranged themselves in my mind like puzzle pieces clicking into place. The light laughter when I'd once casually mentioned long-term equity. The gentle deflection when I asked about future governance. The way succession discussions never quite included me. I had been assigned a role from the beginning, not a partner, not a stakeholder, not a successor. Operator. There's dignity in operational excellence. I don't diminish that. Systems matter. Execution matters. But when execution creates value, and that value consolidates upward without acknowledgement, something becomes unbalanced. I wasn't angry, I was awake, and awareness is quieter than anger. It doesn't shout, it recalculates. That night, after our son was asleep, I asked Daniel carefully, "Have you ever thought about what formal role I'll have in the company long term?" He looked surprised, not defensive, just surprised. "You're already integral, Meg. Everyone knows that." Integral. I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said. "But on paper?" He hesitated just slightly. "We've never really discussed it that way." That was the moment I understood fully. The role I was assigned wasn't temporary. It was assumed to be permanent, reliable, useful. invisible. And the most dangerous roles are the ones no one thinks to question. The day it happened wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no public humiliation, no dramatic betrayal. Just a sentence. We were seated in Richard's office. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, framed photos of company milestones lining the wall. Daniel sat to my right. Mark is across from me. The company attorney joined via speakerphone. It was meant to be a routine governance review. Expansion into 2 additional states required some restructuring. Nothing radical, just paperwork. As the attorney walked through the updates, he mentioned adjusting voting rights and equity protections among existing shareholders. Existing shareholders. I felt my throat tighten slightly, but I kept my voice even. Should we revisit ownership structure while we're restructuring? I asked calmly. Given how operational roles have evolved over the years? The room went quiet. Not tense, just surprised. Richard leaned back in his chair. What do you mean? I folded my hands gently. I mean that I've been managing core operations for several years now. It might make sense to formalize that alignment on paper. There was a pause. Then Mark let out a short laugh. Not cruel, not loud, just reflexive. Oh, come on, Megan, he said, still smiling. We're not redrafting the family tree. Daniel gave a half smile too, as if smoothing the moment. You know, it's always been structured this way, Richard added almost kindly. You're compensated well, and you're part of this family. That doesn't need paperwork. That was it. No attack, no insult. Just dismissal packaged as reassurance. They moved on quickly. The attorney resumed speaking. Voting percentages, liability protections, succession clauses. I stopped listening because something inside me had gone completely still. Not hurt, not embarrassed. Still, I realized in that moment that I had miscalculated one fundamental thing. I had believed that if I contributed enough, proved enough, stabilized enough, they would eventually see formal inclusion as logical. But they didn't see my role as evolving. They saw it as supportive by nature. Permanent support. The laughter wasn't about the idea being impossible. It was about it being unthinkable. And that distinction changed everything. I didn't argue. I didn't push. I didn't defend my reasoning. I nodded once. Understood. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. I gathered my notebook, thanked the attorney politely, and walked out with the others. No one sensed a shift. At lunch, Mark joked about corporate coups. Daniel squeezed my hand casually under the table, as if to reassure me that everything was fine. Everything was fine, but something inside me had detached from expectation. That night, after everyone was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table alone. The house was quiet in the way only midnight can be. I replayed the laughter in my mind, not emotionally, but analytically. They hadn't meant to belittle me. That was the truth. They simply couldn't imagine a structure where I wasn't auxiliary. And suddenly, I understood something with uncomfortable clarity. If I continued contributing under the current structure, I would remain permanently valuable, but never protected. Valuable is conditional. Protected is structural. I had been chasing validation. What I needed was positioning. The shift wasn't fiery. It wasn't fueled by revenge. It was administrative. I opened my laptop, not to confront anyone, not to draft an email, but to begin understanding every document I had never bothered to study closely before. Shareholder agreements, voting thresholds, exit clauses, buy-sell provisions. For the first time, I wasn't reviewing systems to improve them. I was reviewing systems to understand my exposure. That was the night the internal conversation changed. I stopped asking myself, how do I prove my worth? And started asking, what protects my future? I didn't announce this pivot. I didn't threaten departure. I didn't withdraw effort. Externally, nothing changed. Internally, everything did. Because I finally accepted one quiet truth. If they would never imagine me at the table, I needed to build leverage that didn't require imagination. And from that night forward, my silence wasn't patience anymore. It was preparation. After that meeting, something subtle but decisive shifted in the way I moved through the company. From the outside, I looked exactly the same. I arrived early. I left late when necessary. I attended meetings. I solved problems. I smiled when appropriate. If anything, I became even more composed. But my silence changed texture. Before, my quietness had been hopeful. I stayed silent because I believed acknowledgement would eventually come, because harmony felt productive, because I trusted that contribution naturally translated into inclusion over time. Now my silence was deliberate. I stopped volunteering strategic suggestions unless directly asked. I continued executing flawlessly, but I no longer overextended. If a system required optimization, I documented the inefficiency and implemented corrections within my scope. I didn't hand them expansion blueprints unless it served a specific purpose. And that confused them slightly. Not enough to question me, just enough to notice. Megan's been quieter lately, Mark mentioned casually one afternoon. Daniel shrugged. She's just focused. He wasn't wrong. I was focused. Intensely. But not on what they thought. I began observing conversations the way an outsider might. When Richard spoke about long-term succession, I listened carefully to the phrasing. When the attorney referenced liability structures, I made mental notes. When voting rights were discussed in abstract, I tracked percentages in my head. They mistook my restraint for compliance. That was their first miscalculation. At home, Daniel occasionally asked, "Everything okay at work?" "Yes," I would answer truthfully, because nothing was broken. I wasn't plotting destruction. I wasn't nursing resentment. I was recalibrating my relationship to risk. For the first time, I calculated what would happen if I left. Not emotionally, operationally. Which vendor relationships were tied directly to me? Which compliance processes only existed in the documentation I had personally structured? Which client renewals depended on the retention systems I had implemented? I realized something quietly powerful. I wasn't just an employee, I was a knowledge hub. Years of invisible labor had created asymmetrical information flow. I knew which contracts were fragile, which managers were underperforming, which clients were loyal to systems rather than personalities. They thought my power was operational. In reality, it was informational, and information, when organized correctly, becomes leverage. But leverage is useless if handled emotionally. So I stayed calm. I began keeping personal copies of non-confidential documentation. Nothing illegal, nothing unethical. Just records of my authored processes, my frameworks, my communications, my performance metrics, not to threaten, to anchor. At meetings, when ideas were reintroduced by others, I didn't react. I simply adjusted my internal ledger. I tracked who positioned themselves as strategic leaders versus who relied on infrastructure they didn't fully understand. The more I observed, the clearer a pattern became. The company's public strength rested on operational stability. Operational stability rested on me. And yet, structurally, I held no formal protection. That imbalance no longer offended me. It interested me. Silence gave me perspective. Without the emotional noise of wanting recognition, I could see architecture. The architecture favored legacy, but it depended on execution. And execution had a name, mine. One evening, Daniel mentioned casually, Dad's talking about accelerating the expansion timeline, bigger risks, faster moves. I nodded thoughtfully. Does the current operational structure support that pace? He hesitated. We'd have to adapt. Yes, you would. For the first time, I felt the difference between being necessary and being acknowledged. Necessary is power. Acknowledged is optional. They still saw my quietness as loyalty, as steadiness, as maturity. They had no idea it was an evaluation. Because silence, when chosen consciously, stops being passive. It becomes strategic. And the more they mistook it for weakness, the more freedom I had to prepare without resistance. I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was building clarity. And clarity, when paired with patience, becomes something far more durable than confrontation. It becomes inevitable. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That's why no one noticed. If anything, they felt reassured. The company was running smoothly. Expansion timelines were moving forward. Margins were stable. Internal audits were clean. I was doing my job, but I was also doing something else. Quietly, methodically, without altering my visible behavior. I began mapping the company the way an investor would, not emotionally attached, not as a wife, not as a daughter-in-law. As a strategist, I created a private document, not confidential information, just analysis. Operational dependencies, key person risks, vendor concentration ratios, client retention vulnerabilities, insurance exposure points, debt covenants tied to expansion financing. I realized something uncomfortable. The company's growth strategy assumed continuity of institutional knowledge that was never formally documented, which meant it assumed me. Processes lived in my head more than in manuals. Relationships existed because I had nurtured them consistently. Certain regulatory nuances were managed proactively because I anticipated them before they surfaced. None of that was written into succession planning because succession planning assumed I wasn't part of succession. That oversight wasn't malicious. It was habitual. So I began correcting it, not for them, but for myself. I formalized systems in ways that increased transparency while preserving authorship. I time-stamped revisions. I clarified communication channels. I ensured that my contributions were traceable, not loudly, just clearly. At the same time, I expanded my own leverage outside the company. I enrolled in an executive finance certification program, quietly, online. I updated my professional network profile, not publicly announcing anything, just reconnecting with former colleagues. I attended 2 industry conferences alone, instead of alongside Daniel, positioning myself independently rather than as an extension. No one objected. Why would they? From their perspective, I was growing professionally in ways that benefited the business. They didn't see the secondary effect, optionality. I began meeting privately with a financial advisor. Not about divorce, not about departure, but about asset structures, personal protection, risk mitigation. If something happened legally, financially, structurally, what was mine? The answer unsettled me less than I had assumed because salary builds income, equity builds security, and I had been paid well but positioned vulnerably. One afternoon, while reviewing supplier contracts, I noticed something else significant. A clause tied to expansion financing required continuity of key operational oversight personnel. It didn't name me, but it described my role. I sat back in my chair and read the clause again. If I were removed suddenly, it could trigger review conditions from lenders. Not catastrophic, but disruptive. That was the first time I felt something close to clarity crystallize. not excitement, not triumph, just understanding. My value wasn't sentimental, it was structural, and structures are measurable. I didn't celebrate this discovery. I didn't fantasize about dramatic exits. I didn't even change my demeanor. Instead, I did what I had always done best. I organized. I documented every system I managed. But I also ensured that access pathways required my oversight. Again, nothing unethical, nothing manipulative, just clean professional boundaries. If someone wanted deeper operational insight, they would need collaboration. For years, I had given that access freely, instinctively. Now I calibrated it. I also started something else, something they would never have suspected. I tracked how often my ideas were reintroduced without attribution, not to confront, to observe patterns, because patterns reveal positioning, and positioning reveals leverage. The more I studied the architecture of the company, the more I saw what they had missed. They believed ownership was power. But ownership without operational comprehension is fragile, and fragility doesn't show until pressure increases. Expansion would increase pressure. Debt would increase pressure. Market volatility would increase pressure. And under pressure, the quiet systems matter more than the loud leadership. They never noticed my preparation because it looked identical to dedication. That was the advantage of having been underestimated for so long. No one guards against the quiet one. They only guard against the loud. And I had no intention of becoming loud. Not yet. The moment of clarity didn't arrive in a boardroom. It came on a Thursday afternoon, alone in my office, with a stack of expansion financing documents spread across my desk. We were finalizing terms with a regional bank to support the Nevada and Arizona expansions. Growth required capital. Capital required conditions. I had read the draft agreements before, but this time I read them differently. Not as operations coordinator, as a risk analyst. Buried in the covenant section was a provision labeled Continuity of Essential Management. It outlined the bank's right to reassess credit terms if specific operational leadership changes materially impacted performance stability. No names were listed, but the responsibilities described: vendor contract governance, compliance oversight, multi-state logistics integration, mapped almost exactly to my portfolio. I read it 3 times. Then I cross-referenced it with internal role descriptions, then with the previous audit summaries, then with our insurance documentation. It became undeniable. The company's valuation and lending confidence were implicitly tied to the systems I had built and personally overseen. And yet, legally, I held no equity, no voting rights, no succession clause. In that moment, the imbalance stopped being philosophical. It became mathematical. If I remained indefinitely in my current role, I would continue generating structural stability that increased shareholder value, value I did not participate in. If I left abruptly, it would trigger operational disruption and potentially lender scrutiny, something they clearly had not calculated carefully. I leaned back in my chair and felt something unexpected, not anger, relief. Because ambiguity is exhausting, clarity is quiet. For years, I had sensed something misaligned, but couldn't articulate it cleanly. Now I could. I wasn't undervalued emotionally. I was underpositioned structurally. There's a difference. One can be fixed with reassurance. The other requires reconfiguration. I didn't print the documents dramatically. I didn't call anyone. I didn't confront Daniel that evening. Instead, I opened a blank document and began outlining scenarios. Scenario A: continue indefinitely. Outcome: income stable. Equity growth bypasses me. Risk exposure unchanged. Scenario B: negotiate equity inclusion proactively. Outcome: potential resistance. Structural recalibration, long-term protection. Scenario C, gradual disengagement and external repositioning. Outcome, company destabilization risk. Personal autonomy increases. Scenario D, strategic leverage during refinancing or governance shift. Outcome, highest negotiation power. Requires timing precision. I stared at the list for a long time. This wasn't revenge. It was architecture. And architecture rewards timing. The private reveal wasn't about discovering a secret clause. It was about understanding my weight inside the system. They believed ownership gave them control. But control in complex organizations depends on operational continuity. And operational continuity depended on me, not emotionally, contractually. For the first time, I saw that my years of quiet diligence had created something powerful, not visible, not flashy, but undeniable. Dependency. Dependency is dangerous if mismanaged, but it is also a leverage if handled with discipline. I closed the documents carefully and locked them in my drawer, not to hide them, but to signal to myself that this knowledge was stable. That night, Daniel mentioned casually, "The bank seems confident. They like our structure." I smiled softly. "I'm sure they do," I said. And I meant it, because the structure was solid. I had built much of it. The difference now was this. They believed the structure secured them. I understood that the structure included me, whether they acknowledged it or not. And that understanding changed the balance of power. Not publicly, not yet, but internally. I no longer felt peripheral. I felt central. And when you know you are central, you stop negotiating from insecurity. You negotiate from inevitability. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt prepared. The reveal was private, but its consequences would not be. Clarity creates options, and options create responsibility. For several weeks after my private realization, I didn't act. I observed. I waited for the right inflection point, something structural enough to justify a shift, not emotional enough to look reactive. It arrived sooner than I expected. Richard announced that the expansion timeline would accelerate by 6 months. "Market conditions are favorable," he said confidently during a leadership meeting. "We move now or we fall behind." Acceleration meant compressed integration schedules. Compressed schedules meant operational strain. And operational strain meant pressure on the exact systems I controlled. I felt the decisions solidify inside me, not suddenly, but steadily. I could continue reinforcing the structure quietly, allowing growth to increase company valuation, while my position remained unchanged. Or I could leverage this moment of expansion, this moment of heightened dependency, to correct the imbalance. Not with threats, with terms. That was the irreversible choice. Because once you shift from silent contributor to structural negotiator, you can't go back to being invisible. I went home that evening and sat alone in the living room long after Daniel fell asleep. The house was quiet, familiar, steady. I asked myself one final question. If nothing changes, will I respect myself in 5 years? The answer came without hesitation. No, not because I needed applause, but because I needed alignment. The next morning, I scheduled a meeting. Not dramatic, not urgent, just titled Operational Governance Review. Neutral language, professional tone. When we gathered in the conference room, I spoke calmly. With expansion accelerating, I began, we should revisit risk concentration across key operational oversight. Lenders are already attentive to continuity clauses. We need structural resilience. Richard nodded. Agreed. What are you suggesting? This was the moment. I didn't mention fairness. I didn't mention past dismissal. I didn't reference the laughter. I referenced risk. Currently, Operational continuity is centralized under one executive without equity alignment, I said evenly. That creates exposure for the company and for lenders. Formalizing governance alignment would stabilize perception and internal structure. Mark frowned slightly. Are you talking about adding more shareholders? I'm talking about aligning responsibility with protection, I replied. Daniel looked at me more carefully than he had in months. Silence filled the room, not dismissive this time, analytical. Richard cleared his throat. This feels sudden. It's not, I said gently. It's overdue. There was no anger in my voice, no accusation, just data. I laid out projections, lender sensitivities, industry governance trends. Retention metrics are tied to leadership stability. I spoke their language now, not as support, but as a stakeholder. For the first time, no one laughed. They didn't agree immediately either. But something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't asking to be included. I was demonstrating why exclusion was structurally inefficient. That distinction matters because one invites sympathy, the other demands calculation. The meeting ended without resolution. Richard said they needed to consult counsel. Mark looked unsettled. Daniel remained quiet, processing. As I walked back to my office, I felt something both heavy and freeing. There was no turning back now. Even if they resisted, the dynamic had changed permanently. They could no longer pretend I was merely operational. I had positioned myself as the central risk architecture. And once someone sees the architecture clearly, they cannot unsee it. The irreversible choice wasn't demanding equity. It was stepping into undeniable leverage. From this point forward, every strategic conversation would carry the awareness of my role, not emotionally, structurally. And structures, once questioned, must either adapt or crack. After that meeting, the atmosphere didn't explode. It condensed. No one confronted me directly. No one accused me of ambition or disloyalty. But the temperature in the room shifted a few degrees cooler, which was fine. Cool environments are easier to think in. Richard scheduled a follow-up call with the company attorney. Mark requested updated operational documentation for clarity. Daniel asked me that evening gently, "Was this something you've been planning for a while?" "Yes," I answered. He nodded slowly, not offended, just recalibrating. This was the phase most people misunderstood. They assume leverage means loud ultimatums. It doesn't. Leverage means alignment of incentives. So I moved carefully. First, I formalized my operational scope in writing. Comprehensive, structured, undeniable. I submitted a governance memo outlining how expansion financing clauses intersect with executive continuity. I referenced lender language directly. I attached performance metrics from the past 3 years demonstrating operational impact on margin stabilization. Not emotional arguments, financial ones. Second, I adjusted workflow transparency. Critical systems were documented clearly, but authority chains were not clarified. Approvals that had once flowed informally now required formal sign-off structures. Nothing obstructive, just professional boundaries. If I was central to operational continuity, that centrality needed visible architecture. Third, I quietly met with my financial advisor again. We discussed asset partitioning, trust structures, contingency protections. If equity negotiations succeeded, how would it be held? If they stalled, what external positioning would maximize my independence within 12 months? No one at the office knew about these conversations. They didn't need to. At work, expansion preparations intensified. Vendor negotiations tightened. Hiring accelerated. Integration timelines shortened. Pressure increased exactly as I predicted. And under pressure, questions surfaced. Who oversees cross state compliance? Megan. Who designed the vendor migration framework? Megan. Who handles lender reporting reconciliation? Megan. Each answer reinforced the same unspoken truth. I didn't repeat my proposal. I didn't remind them. I let reality do the persuasion. About 3 weeks later, Richard called me into his office. He closed the door. We've been reviewing governance structures, he said carefully. Adding equity isn't something we take lightly. I wouldn't expect you to, I replied calmly. He studied me for a moment. You've been different. Focused, I said. He nodded once. You understand that ownership changes dynamics. Yes, I said. That's the point. There was no hostility in the exchange, just gravity. The real movement, however, happened behind closed doors. The attorney began drafting exploratory amendments. Voting percentages were recalculated under hypothetical scenarios. Lender risk exposure was analyzed if executive continuity shifted. They were running numbers, which meant they were taking the premise seriously. Meanwhile, I continued performing flawlessly. No missed deadlines, no emotional leakage, no visible frustration. Because this wasn't about proving I was indispensable, it was about proving that formal alignment reduced systemic risk. One afternoon, Mark approached me unexpectedly. If this goes through, he said cautiously, you'd be taking on more than just operations. I already am, I replied evenly. He didn't argue. That was new. Momentum in negotiations rarely announces itself dramatically. It builds in spreadsheets, in side conversations, in recalculated projections. By the time formal discussions resumed in a full meeting, the tone had shifted entirely. No laughter, no dismissal, just numbers on a screen. Ownership percentages adjusted modestly, but meaningfully. Governance language revised to reflect executive continuity alignment. Vesting schedules are structured to balance risk. It wasn't symbolic, it was structural. And the most powerful part, I never raised my voice. I never threatened departure. I never invoked fairness. I simply allowed the architecture to reveal its own logic. Moving in silence doesn't mean doing nothing. It means letting systems speak louder than emotion. And by the time they realized how central I was to those systems, the negotiation wasn't about inclusion anymore. It was about stability. Equity doesn't change a room immediately. It changes gradually. The amendment was finalized 2 months later. Not a dramatic restructuring, not a takeover, a measured recalibration. My name has been added to shareholder documents, a defined voting percentage, a vesting schedule tied to operational performance benchmarks. I was already exceeding. On paper, it looked modest. In reality, it shifted gravity. The first consequence wasn't a celebration, it was silent. At the next leadership meeting, when Richard opened the discussion on expansion pacing, he paused before moving forward. Megan, what's your view on risk tolerance here? He had asked my opinion before, but this time, it wasn't informational. It was directional. The subtlety mattered. Mark became more cautious in how he framed operational initiatives. Ideas that once bypassed me now arrived in draft form for collaboration. Not because he suddenly admired me more, because misalignment now had financial implications. Daniel at home adjusted too. There was a new awareness in how he discussed strategy with me. Fewer assumptions, more partnership. It wasn't romantic, it was respectful. And respect, when it's structural, feels different than reassurance. The second consequence was discomfort, not hostility, just recalibration. Richard struggled quietly with the shift. He had built the company from scratch. Ownership, to him, symbolized legacy. Seeing my name alongside his son's likely unsettled something he couldn't articulate. One afternoon, He said to me, almost thoughtfully, "You've always been steady. I didn't realize you were thinking this far ahead." "I've always been thinking this far ahead," I replied gently. He nodded slowly. There was no apology, but there was recognition. The third consequence was operational clarity, because now that responsibility and protection were aligned. I no longer hesitated to make executive level calls when necessary. Vendor terminations happened faster. Risk mitigation decisions were decisive. I no longer filtered my authority through someone else's title. And that increased efficiency. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very structure they once resisted made the company stronger. But there were subtler shifts too. Extended family gatherings changed tone. Conversations about the boys steering the future softened into the leadership team. Introductions at industry events expanded slightly. "This is Megan, one of our partners." The word landed differently. Partner. It didn't inflate me. It stabilized me. Not everyone adjusted smoothly. A mid-level manager once attempted to circumvent a policy update I implemented. Previously, he might have appealed to Mark directly. This time, Mark redirected him back to me. "She has authority on that," he said. The message traveled quietly through the organization. Authority recognized is authority reinforced. But consequences don't only affect others, they affect you too. I had to confront something internally. For years, invisibility had protected me from exposure. If a decision failed, it wasn't fully mine. If strategy misfired, accountability rested elsewhere. Now, ownership meant shared risk. No more safe adjacency, full participation. And strangely, that felt lighter, because responsibility without protection breeds resentment. Responsibility with protection breeds clarity. The most telling consequence, however, was subtle. The laughter never returned, not because they feared me, but because the premise had shifted. My request had once seemed unthinkable. Now it was precedent. And precedent changes future conversations before they begin. One evening, Daniel said quietly, "I didn't realize how much we were leaning on you without formalizing it." I looked at him calmly. "I did," I said. There was no accusation in my voice, just truth. And truth, when delivered without heat, lands deeper. The consequences weren't explosive, they were architectural. The balance had corrected. Not dramatically, not violently, but definitively. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel peripheral. I felt aligned. Power shifts don't create noise immediately. They create awareness. And awareness, especially when it arrives late, can feel like regret. A few months after the equity restructuring, market conditions tightened unexpectedly. Freight volatility increased. Fuel costs fluctuated sharply. One of our mid-sized competitors expanded aggressively and undercut pricing in 2 regions. Pressure returned to the system, but this time, the architecture was different. During an emergency strategy session, tensions rose faster than usual. Mark pushed for rapid price adjustments. Daniel argued for client retention stability. Richard worried about lender perception. For the first time, I didn't wait for consensus. "We slow the Arizona rollout by 90 days, I said evenly. "Preserve liquidity buffer. Adjust vendor renegotiations now, not reactively." The room went quiet. Richard instinctively began to counter, then paused, because now my vote counted. Not symbolically, contractually. He looked at the numbers projected on the screen, then back at me. "If we delay," he said slowly, "we send a signal. If we don't," I replied, calm and measured, "we increase exposure under tightened credit review." Silence. Then Daniel nodded once. "She's right." The motion passed, and in that moment, something irreversible settled into the room. Not dominance, balance. Later that week, I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. Richard is speaking quietly with Daniel in his office. I should have formalized this years ago, he admitted. We didn't see it, Daniel responded softly. She did. There it was. Regret doesn't always come with apology. Sometimes it arrives as hindsight. But hindsight doesn't rewind structures, it only confirms them. There were smaller signs too. Mark grew more careful in meetings, less dismissive, more collaborative. At family dinners, Richard began introducing me differently. Megan's been steering operational strategy, he said one evening. Steering. The language had changed, but what struck me most wasn't their adjustment. It was my detachment from needing it. If they had suddenly praised me 5 years earlier, it might have satisfied something vulnerable inside me. It might have softened my insistence on structural alignment. Now, praise felt pleasant, but irrelevant, because the real correction wasn't emotional recognition, it was protection. One afternoon, Richard asked me privately, "Did we make you feel excluded?" I considered the question carefully. "Not intentionally," I said. He nodded slowly, waiting. "But intention doesn't change impact." He absorbed that quietly. "I suppose we thought you were content." "I was committed," I replied. "That's different." That distinction lingered in the air. Contentment is passive. Commitment is active. They had mistaken one for the other. And by the time they recognized the difference, the structure had already changed. Too late to fix the old imbalance. Too late to revert to comfortable assumptions. Too late to pretend my role was auxiliary. There's a subtle grief in realizing you underestimated someone close to you. Not because they punish you, but because they grew beyond the frame you placed around them. I saw that grief flicker across Richard's face occasionally. Not guilt, not shame, just recalibration. And that was enough. Because this was never about humiliation. It was about alignment. And alignment, once achieved, doesn't require anyone to kneel. It simply requires them to adjust their stance. The company stabilized. The delayed rollout preserved liquidity exactly as projected. Lenders remained confident. Vendor renegotiations softened cost spikes. The structure held, and everyone in that room knew why. Not because I said it, but because the math did. By the time they fully understood my leverage, it was no longer leverage. It was leadership. And leadership, once formalized, cannot be quietly erased again. The real confrontation didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened on a Sunday afternoon at Richard's house, with sunlight coming through the kitchen windows and the smell of overcooked roast in the air. No spreadsheets, no attorney, no formal agenda, just family. After lunch, while Daniel took our son outside, Richard asked if I could stay back for a moment. We sat at the same oak table where months earlier he had toasted the boys steering the future. He folded his hands in front of him, an unfamiliar gesture. He was usually expansive, gesturing when he spoke. Today, he was contained. "I owe you something," he said. I didn't rush to fill the silence. "When you first brought up being in the papers," he continued, "I laughed. I shouldn't have." There was no defensiveness in his tone, no justification, just acknowledgement. I studied his face. This was a man who had built something from nothing, a man who equated control with protection. Letting someone into ownership wasn't just a financial decision for him, it was emotional. "You didn't think it was necessary," I said evenly. He nodded. "I didn't think you needed it." There it was again. Need. I didn't need validation, I replied calmly. I needed alignment. He exhaled slowly, absorbing that. "I thought we were taking care of you," he said. "You were," I said. "But care isn't the same as equity." The conversation could have turned tense there. It didn't, because I wasn't angry anymore. There's a difference between confronting someone while you're still wounded and confronting them after you've healed. When you're wounded, you want an apology. When you're healed, You want clarity. He looked at me carefully. Did you ever think about leaving? Yes, I said. The honesty hung between us. And you didn't, he said. No, I replied. I chose to stay, but I wasn't going to stay invisible. That was the entire truth. No accusation, no raised voice, just boundary. Richard nodded slowly. I underestimated you. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't struggle to say it. He didn't choke on pride. He simply acknowledged it. And in that moment, something softened. Not in me, but in him. Because the confrontation wasn't about forcing him to shrink, it was about allowing him to expand his perception. I never wanted to take anything from your sons, I added quietly. I wanted the structure to reflect reality. He gave a faint, almost reluctant smile. It does now. Yes, I said. We sat there for a moment in silence. Not awkward, just reflective. When Daniel walked back inside, he glanced between us, sensing something had shifted. Everything okay? He asked. Everything's aligned, I answered, and that was enough. There were no fireworks, no grand declarations of respect, no emotional speeches about family unity, just a recalibrated understanding, the kind that doesn't echo loudly, but lasts. The confrontation without heat wasn't about winning. It was about standing still long enough for the truth to settle. I didn't need them to feel guilty. I needed them to see me clearly. And clarity, once achieved calmly, doesn't create enemies. It creates equilibrium. For the first time since I joined that family and that company, I wasn't positioned as support. I was positioned as an equal, not louder, not dominant, just undeniable. And sometimes, that's the most powerful confrontation of all. If you met me today, you might not notice anything extraordinary. I still arrive early. I still prefer clean spreadsheets to dramatic speeches. I still listen more than I talk. From the outside, I look almost unchanged. But internally, I am entirely different. The biggest shift isn't the equity. It's the absence of negotiation inside myself. I no longer debate whether I deserve to be at the table. I no longer measure my value by how quickly others acknowledge it. I no longer soften my authority to preserve comfort in the room. I speak when necessary. I withhold when strategic. And I don't confuse silence with invisibility anymore. Ownership changed more than my title. It changed my posture, subtly, permanently. When decisions are made now, I don't angle my contributions to fit someone else's frame. I contribute to alignment. If a proposal increases risk, I say so. If a direction feels unsustainable, I articulate it, not defensively, not aggressively, just clearly. The irony is that the more grounded I became, the less I needed to prove anything. There's a quiet confidence that comes from structural security. It removes the emotional static. At home, Daniel and I operate differently too. We discuss strategy as partners, not because of paperwork, but because of perspective. He sees me not as support behind the scenes, but as someone who carries equal weight in outcomes. That shift didn't create tension, it created balance. And with Richard, something unexpected happened. Our conversations became more honest. He asks my opinion directly now, not as a courtesy, but as a reliance. Sometimes, he even challenges me more than he challenges his sons. That used to intimidate me. Now I welcome it, because challenge is respect in disguise. I don't carry bitterness about the past. I understand it more clearly now. The structure I stepped into was built before I arrived. Tradition has gravity. People default to familiar roles without malice. But I also understand something else. If you allow yourself to remain convenient, people will rarely disrupt that convenience voluntarily. Change required me to disrupt it, calmly. The younger women in the company watch me differently now. I notice it. They ask more direct questions about leadership paths, about equity, about long term positioning. I answer them honestly. Competence earns trust, I tell them, but structure earns protection. That distinction matters. Who I am now isn't louder, it's anchored. I don't chase recognition. I don't rehearse speeches in my head. I don't track how often my ideas are attributed correctly. Because the foundation beneath me is no longer conditional. There's a particular kind of peace that comes from knowing you don't need permission to occupy your own role. I didn't destroy anything to get here. I didn't humiliate anyone. I didn't storm out dramatically. I adjusted the architecture. And architecture, when adjusted correctly, outlasts emotion. When I think back to that afternoon in Richard's office, the casual laughter when I asked to be on the papers, I don't feel anger. I feel gratitude for the clarity it forced. Because that was the moment I stopped asking and started preparing. And preparation changed me more than ownership ever could. When I look back on this entire journey, I don't see a battle. I see a correction. No one set out to diminish me. No one gathered in a room and decided I should remain invisible. The structure existed before I fully examined it. I stepped into it willingly. I contributed to it. I benefited from it. But I also allowed myself to remain unprotected inside it. That's the part I own. The day they laughed when I asked to be on the family business papers wasn't the worst day of my life. It wasn't humiliating. It wasn't explosive. It was clarifying. Because in that moment, I realized something many capable women eventually confront. Being essential is not the same as being acknowledged. And being acknowledged is not the same as being secured. For years, I mistook quiet appreciation for structural alignment. I believed patience would naturally evolve into equity. I assumed contribution alone would shift perception. It didn't. What shifted perception was preparation, not emotional confrontation, not public defiance, not revenge. Preparation, understanding the system better than anyone else, knowing my leverage without advertising it, aligning responsibility with protection, speaking once clearly when timing made the argument undeniable. That's what changed everything. Quiet dominance isn't about overpowering someone. It's about no longer negotiating against yourself. It's about recognizing when you've outgrown the role you were assigned and adjusting the architecture rather than attacking the people inside it. Today, I don't feel triumphant. I feel aligned. The company is stronger. My family is intact. My position is secure. And the respect I receive now doesn't come from emotion. It comes from structure. If there's one lesson I would leave you with, it's this. If you're carrying weight in a room, make sure the room reflects it, not loudly, not angrily, but clearly, because silence can be weakness, or it can be a strategy. The difference is intention. I stopped asking, I started preparing. And when the moment came, I didn't need to fight for my place. It was already undeniable. So I'm curious, have you ever realized that the problem wasn't your effort, but the structure around you? Tell me in the comments.